The evening air over Minneapolis was thick with the smell of summer asphalt, warmed under a relentless sun. George Perry Floyd, Jr. had been restless all day. His tall frame leaned lazily against the seat of the blue SUV parked along Chicago Avenue, but his mind was racing. He'd come here for a quick errand, nothing more, just a small purchase from Cup Foods, but fate has a habit of lurking in mundane corners. Inside the store, Christopher Martin, a 17-year-old cashier with a calm face and cautious eyes, turned a $20 bill over between his fingers. It looked off. He'd been trained to spot counterfeits, and this one had that lifeless color that always raised suspicion. He didn't want trouble. He didn't want to be the one to make the call. But the quiet rules of his job, the ones written between the lines, said he had to. So hesitantly, he spoke to his manager, who made the decision for him. Minutes later, the call went out. A possible counterfeit bill, African American, male, tall, inside a vehicle outside the store. When officers Thomas Lane and J. Alexander Kyung arrived, the evening still hadn't shifted into the storm it was destined to become. Lane approached Floyd's vehicle with a rigid authority that rookie cops sometimes wear like armor. His hand went to his holster, then eased off. Floyd was surprised, a little confused, and wary, a man who had been in and out of the system before, who knew that any wrong move could send a moment spiraling. They pulled him from the SUV, cuffed his wrists. Floyd's voice was calm at first, almost pleading. "Please, man, I didn't do nothing." Across the street, pedestrians slowed, sensing something uncomfortable brewing. They sat him down against the wall, then walked him toward their squad car. That's when the fear started to show. He told them about his claustrophobia, how he couldn't breathe in tight spaces. The more they pushed, the more he resisted stepping inside. It wasn't a violent resistance, more the desperate recoil of a man trapped between the cold metal of a cruiser and the shadows of his own panic. Then came the second patrol car. Derek Michael Chauvin stepped out, followed by two Thou. Chauvin moved like a man who had decided the ending before the story began. Words passed quickly between officers. Decisions were made in glances. And then, in a motion that would stain the city's name into history, Floyd was taken to the ground. The pavement was unforgiving under his cheek, his breath already tight from the struggle. Chauvin's knee pressed into his neck. Not for moments, not for a minute or two, for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. The sound of Floyd's voice cut through the street, desperate, raw, and human. "I can't breathe. Mama, I'm through." Each word was both a plea and a prophecy. Darnella Frazier, 17 years old, held her phone steady, recording. Behind her, voices rose in chorus. "He's not resisting. Get off him." Tu Thao stood like a gatekeeper, his eyes flicking toward the growing crowd, hands resting near his baton. No one could break through. The air felt heavier with each passing second, the sun dipping lower, while life drained from the man on the ground. When Floyd's body stilled, silence swept the scene, broken only by the mechanical arrival of paramedics. But Chauvin didn't move. Even when the world in front of him was already gone, his weight remained, as though victory was measured in the absence of breath. By nightfall, the video was online. By dawn, the city had ignited. Minneapolis, then America, then the world. Protests surged, not just against one man's death, but against every silent nod, every looked-away moment that had allowed something like this to happen. But in the shadows of that global roar, there was a quiet rage growing. Not the blind rage of fire and broken glass, but a slow, methodical rage. Among those watching was a man who knew George from Houston, someone who had once been pulled from his own spiral by George's kindness. His name was Marcus Reed, and he had no faith in justice as it was advertised, but he believed in balance, and balance, he decided, would be restored, not in the courts, but in the lives of those who had taken George's life. Marcus didn't announce his plan. He didn't post hashtags. He started with files, public records, leaked body cam footage, disciplinary histories. He mapped out every name, every home address, every buried complaint that had been handled internally. And when he began to move, it was without a single warning. By the time Derek Chauvin's trial began, Marcus was already deep in the game, not in the headlines, but in the gaps between them. Small surgical strikes against the reputations, finances, and comfort of those who had stood by and watched George Floyd die. And when he was done with Chauvin, he would turn to Thao, Kyung, and Lane.
Because Marcus knew something the city didn't yet understand. The slow revenge of a patient man can burn longer than any riot. Marcus Reed worked like a man with no clock and no conscience for his targets. The media's eyes were locked on the courtroom, every camera lens trained on Derek Chauvin's stone-carved face. But Marcus was building a case of his own, not for a judge, not for a jury, but for the street-level justice George never got to see. His first move was quiet. A month before Chauvin's sentencing, Marcus leaked an anonymous tip to a local investigative reporter about a decades-old brutality complaint Chauvin had buried. The story hit the papers like an uninvited guest at a funeral, embarrassing, damaging, and impossible to ignore. Chauvin's attorney tried to get the piece pulled, but the internet had already done its work. Then came the bank accounts. Marcus knew a man, ex-IRS, bitter and broke, who still had access to certain forgotten databases. A few late-night exchanges in a diner booth, a stack of cash, and soon Marcus was in possession of documents that mapped every property, asset, and shell account tied to Chauvin's family. One by one, those assets became poisoned. Mortgage lenders called with clerical errors that delayed payments. Credit card companies froze lines over suspicious activity. Insurance premiums tripled without warning. It was the kind of slow bleed you couldn't sue your way out of. Thomas Lane was next. Lane had been the first to approach George, the one who had pulled his gun for no reason other than control. Marcus followed him for 3 weeks, learning his routines, his favorite coffee shop, his new girlfriend's apartment. When Marcus struck, it wasn't with fists, it was with whispers. Pictures of Lane with his badge off ended up in anonymous envelopes delivered to his girlfriend's building, along with photocopies of the complaint reports from that night. Within a month, the relationship imploded. Lane moved apartments twice in 6 weeks. He started checking over his shoulder so often, people on the street began to notice. For J. Alexander Kuhn, Marcus chose a different poison: public humiliation. Kuhn had once applied for a teaching position at a police academy. The rejection letter was polite but firm. Marcus got into the academy's alumni mailing list and, using a carefully crafted email chain, sent a dossier of Kuhn's role in George's death to every instructor, student, and staff member. Screenshots of his face kneeling next to Chauvin became the backdrop of late-night discussions in classrooms and dorm lounges. Kuhn withdrew from every public event, retreating into a shadow that seemed to follow him everywhere. Tao was trickier. The man had stood between George and the crowd, the human wall that kept help from reaching him. Marcus decided Tao's punishment should come from the same community he'd once sworn to protect. He started with flyers, clean, bold typography, no shouting, just a photograph of Tao in that night with the words, "Would you trust this man to protect your family?" He posted them around Tao's neighborhood at 3 a.m., careful to avoid cameras. Soon, the flyers appeared on car windshields, church notice boards, even slipped under the door of Tao's own parents' home. Marcus didn't stop at psychological warfare. He reached into their livelihoods. He sent letters using fake legal letterheads to every potential employer they approached after leaving the force, warning of pending civil actions that didn't actually exist. Interviews were canceled. Job offers were rescinded. The officers began to feel the same suffocating pressure George had felt, not physical, but inescapable. Months passed, and while the world moved on to the next headline, the four men who had knelt around George Floyd found their lives in tatters. None of them could keep steady work. Their families endured constant harassment. Their friends drifted away, and none of it could be traced to Marcus Reed. The final act of Marcus's revenge came on the anniversary of George's death. That morning, an unmarked envelope arrived at each of their doors. Inside was a single photo. George Floyd, smiling, holding a young Marcus's shoulder from years ago in Houston. On the back, in careful handwriting, were the words, "This is the man you took from me. This is the weight you'll carry until your last breath. I will never let you forget." No threats, no name, just a promise, already fulfilled. And somewhere in Minneapolis, Marcus Reed stood in the shadow of a mural painted in George's honor, the crowd around him chanting, "Say his name." He said it too, not for the cameras, not for the news, but as a vow to himself. George Floyd's killers might have escaped that street that night, but they would never escape the streets.